Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome all of you to the Islamic Art Symposium. And it's my honor to introduce you to the next speaker, D. Fairchild Ruggles, who's a professor of art, architecture, landscape history at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and co-founder and co-director of the Collaborative for Cultural Heritage and Museum Practices. Her work focuses primarily on the gardens and architecture of Islamic Spain and South Asia, especially the close connections between garden making, the irrigated agricultural landscape, and the power of the sovereign panoramic view. In recent years, she has contributed to the Heritage Trust of Baroda's successful nomination of the pilgrimage city, Champaner Pavagadh, India, as UNESCO World Heritage Site. In the United States, she recently appeared in the PBS special documentary program, Cities of Light, The Rise and Fall of Islamic Spain. Her current recent projects are a volume of sources and documents on Islamic art and visual culture, and a study of the history of art's patronage by women in the Islamic world. Now, I would like to welcome D. Fairchild Ruggles, who's going to speak about the Great Mosque of Cordoba, fruited trees and ablution fountains.
Change our water sources. Of course, I would like to thank our organizers and VCUQ, as have all of the speakers, but I would also like to thank our presenters. I have never heard such articulate and generous and really quite beautiful introductions, and I have to say I myself have never sounded so good as I did 30 seconds ago in the words of these generous young students. So I would like to thank our presenters, by which I mean not the paper givers, but the introducers. Yes. Technology that always gets us. Well, first slide. Architecture and gardens are immensely visible cultural productions, big in scale, majestic. They force themselves upon the viewer and claim attention for their beauty, their splendor, and their size. However, in most areas of the Islamic world, neither the building nor the garden could exist without a sophisticated and far-reaching system of water management to obtain, preserve, and distribute water to a community, a city, and its individual buildings. And we've been hearing quite a bit about this, including some of the technology that makes this possible. I've written elsewhere about the aesthetics of gardens and water features, and we've just had a wonderful kind of romp through a great many of my favorite gardens. So today, instead of focusing on that, I'm going to focus on a very kind of ordinary, everyday problem, which is the logistics of water supply in Cordoba, starting with the Roman period, but of course focusing on the Islamic era, which was its great, glorious time. I'll start with a brief look at climate. I'll move from there to the mosque itself, and then finally to a very large context, which is the landscape, and hope to show the hydraulic connection between them. In this sense, I'm also developing a theme that began with our very first paper, which was that of Professor Marcus Milwright. In the southern half of Al-Andalus, which was, of course, the name for Islamic Spain and Portugal, from which we retain the modern regional name of Andalusia, the wet winter months receive plenty of water, but the hot summer months receive virtually none. The city of Cordoba, for example, receives an average rainfall of 85 millimeters in the months, each month of November, December, and January, while during the long summer, the amount drops to almost nothing. This was an economy, however, that was founded on a very long growing season, consisting of a mixed agriculture that included vegetables, which usually require a lot of water, fruit trees, including fruit trees that require water, and roses. Roses were, oddly enough, a significant crop in Cordoba because, of course, it was used not only for cooking but also for perfumes. All of these required plentiful irrigation. And so careful management was essential to capture those rains that did fall in the winter months, to store them and then distribute them in the water when they were most needed. Indeed, throughout the pre-modern Islamic world, the provision of water was one of the government's essential tasks. And many anthropologists have in fact argued that it is around the concept of water that the earliest governments are formed. I'm not making that case today, but just to show how utterly essential water is. Ibn Qutayba, a 9th century man of letters and qadi serving in Abbasid Baghdad, wrote in one of his works, "The Persians used to say, 'He who does not know the art of making the waters flow, the digging of gaps in the banks of the rivers and their beds, and the blocking of the ravines, and the daily increase and decrease of the watercourses, the perception of the new moon and the doings connected with it, the weighing of the scales, the measuring of the triangle and the quadrangle and the trapezoid, and the setting up of vaulted bridges and embankments and water wheels and buckets for raising water, and the state of the instruments for the workmen and the niceties of arithmetic, is wanting in his capacity as a writer.'" For Ibn Qutayba and his readers, knowledge of water management was an important aspect of being an educated, trained scribe, a government functionary, in other words, which is what I think he meant by writer, because frankly, when I describe a good writer, I don't talk about arithmetic and triangles. When he talked about the increase and decrease of watercourses, he was referring to the control of flow, which requires calculation of slope, and hence the need for geometrical knowledge of triangles and quadrangles, as well as a calculation, the mathematics, for knowing how to allocate water based on units of flow hours. When he mentioned water wheels and buckets, he was referring to the science of engineering, in which simple tools like levers, wheels, and pulleys, this is a pulley system here, were used on a large scale to move huge quantities of water from one level to another. On the screen, I'm showing you a really very simple, it's called a bag and pulley system. We all like to focus on water wheels because they're so monumental. But really, the bag and pulley is the simplest thing to use. It's the one that most of us have used at one time in our life. Anytime you pull water from a well, you're using a pulley system, a very simple tool. And of course, this involves calculation of slope, knowing something about opening embankments and rivers, knowing flow, knowing distribution. Very, very simple, and yet if you get one of those calculations wrong, you don't get any water at all. Such waterworks were necessary attributes of not only cultivated landscapes, but also great cities. And we can see the remains of great Islamic waterworks built in Andalusian cities from the 8th through the 15th centuries, the age when most of Spain and Portugal was under Muslim rule. For example, we have aqueducts and pipes, sometimes included in the city or citadel walls, as seen here in the Islamic walls of the Alcázar of Seville. It's very easy to walk through Seville and miss the aqueduct because it's hidden from view. But if you look carefully, you can just every now and then see one of the openings. We can also refer, of course, to one of these marvelous water wheels, whether propelled by animals or ideally propelled by the current of the river. This is an image of a functioning wheel in Egypt, and of course these wheels are still used today along the Nile. We can also see the remains of such a wheel along the Guadalquivir River in Cordoba. I say the remains of such a wheel, this is really reconstructed, but of course the stone part, the stone framework is original. This was one of many that took advantage of the current to propel the wheel. Indeed, an observer in the 13th century in Cordoba noted 5,000 of them along the river. Maybe that was an exaggeration, but I think he meant there were a lot. Many of them turned mills, but this one did not. This one lifted water in huge cups, or large cups, from the river up to the level of the banks where it flowed into the nearby palace gardens. So it was slightly different from the majority of water wheels that we know of. We can also talk, when we talk about water systems, of course, of bathhouses, which consume a huge amount of water. Several have been excavated in Cordoba. However, here I'm showing you two baths in Granada, two urban baths, and these are baths, And these are evidence of rather sophisticated hydraulic systems. And then, of course, we can talk about the very large basins or the very small basins, the fountains, where water was revealed as an object of beauty and delight. And we've just seen some very nice examples of that in Yasser Tabaz's talk. These might range from a simple garden well in Morocco, as you see here, its rim bearing the marks of countless buckets drawn from its depths to irrigate the garden that it serves. And I always have to remark when I'm teaching my students that this is also one of the traces of women in the history of the world, because the people who are drawing the water from that well are often women. So those little marks on the rim of rope moving over the course of hundreds of years are really the hands of women that we can point to. Of course, I'm very fond of such moments. And we can also refer to more monumental fountains, such as this elephant fountain that poured water into the pool of an Islamic estate in the mountains above Cordoba. I'm very sad to tell you that this elephant is no longer in his natural terrain. He's been moved to a courtyard down in the city where he's harassed by tourists. In planning a city, of course, one of the amenities that the ruler had to provide was a place for congregational prayer. In any mosque, water was a key consideration because of the necessity for ritual ablution before prayer. Therefore, when we read in the chronicles and geographical accounts that a major mosque was erected by such and such a patron, we can deduce that a hydraulic infrastructure was planned at the same time. The hydraulic system would include a bathing facility, a public fountain, and as a visible demonstration of the caliph's beneficence, and it might also include a mosque garden. This last feature has not been well recognized in the scholarly literature on early mosques, but there is plenty of evidence to show that some early mosques were planned with orchards in their courtyards. In the Great Mosque of Cordoba, we can see one of the earliest documented cultivated spaces in the history of the Islamic world. A courtyard that dates to the early 9th century. It is, moreover, as far as I know, the oldest continually planted mosque courtyard in the world. And I'll even go further and say, this is the oldest continually planted Islamic garden in the world. And you will not read that anywhere in print, because nobody knows this, but it's true. And I'm going to show you why. The mosque was built by the first Hispano-Umayyad emir, Abdurrahman I, beginning in 785-86 on the site of a 6th century Visigothic church, St. Vincent. Historical sources relate that the burgeoning Muslim community initially rented space in the church and then purchased the site from the Christians, demolishing the old structure to make way for a new mosque with a handsome prayer hall of 11 aisles and a courtyard. This blue shows you the excavated portion of the church. And when I show you, this is actually a plaque in the mosque itself. And what you need to know is that the mosque that I'm talking about, that very first mosque, has this footprint right here. And you can see that the footprint of the early mosque, all of this is newer addition. The footprint of the early mosque is really aligned and quite similar to that of the church, of which they've excavated this part and this part here. The story of legitimate appropriation, of first renting and then purchasing the church, the story of legitimate appropriation sounds, of course, remarkably like the explanation of the shift from church to mosque in Umayyad Damascus, which suggests that it may have been a story, a fable, an invention, to emphasize the civility of the Muslim conquerors. And on these grounds, a number of modern historians have claimed, incorrectly, that there was no Visigothic church where the Great Mosque now stands. However, there is clear archaeological evidence that shows the remains of a large, well-ornamented church. The archaeology, however, was carried out in the 1930s in Spain. And if you know your Spanish history, you know why it was never published, because of course the Civil War came immediately in that moment. And the excavator had to flee and he just left his notes behind in his office, and they were, in fact, just left there in a dusty box for decades. But they have since been published, and moreover, there have been some new excavations. You see them on the left by the cathedral. Of course, the mosque today is a cathedral, but the cathedral archaeologist Pedro Marfil. So we're very, very secure in understanding exactly what that church consisted of underneath the Great Mosque. The mosque was amplified in the 9th and 10th century as the Muslim population grew. When Cordoba was conquered by the Kingdom of Castile in 1236, the mosque was converted back to a church. This is the history of Spain. Everything's always going back and forth, church, mosque, church, mosque, church, mosque. And lamentably, in the 16th century, the architects of Charles V, who is not one of my favorite characters in history, removed the central portion of the mosque and inserted a cathedral in its place. Throughout these dramatic changes to the architectural fabric of the prayer hall, the courtyard remained, slightly expanded, with its trees, successive generations of oranges and palms, irrigated and tended. And the key word here is irrigated. Early sources indicate that the courtyard was planted with fruit trees from the 8th through 11th centuries. In an 11th century legal case, there was a query to the leading jurist of Cordoba regarding the theological legality of the presence of trees in the mosque. As was customary, the jurist offered his opinion on whether these trees should be there, on the basis of similar court cases and earlier authorities, one of whom was the mosque's imam, who had died in the year 806, very, very early. The jurist concluded that the vegetation in the Cordoba Mosque was indeed a distraction from prayer. So it's not a paradisiac garden that we have here. It is a distraction from the purpose of prayer, of faith. And he recommended that the trees be removed. But of course, ironically, the fact that this court case came up many times, and he could refer to previous authorities, tells you that the trees were never removed, and it was always a problem, a kind of theological, what do we say, fence sitter. Should they be there? Should they not be there? It was never truly resolved. At the same time that he condemned the trees in Cordoba, however, our jurist noted that trees were present in Syrian mosque courtyards. He may have been thinking, and Syria in the greater sense of Al-Shams, he may have been thinking of 7th and 8th century mosques, such as the Great Mosque of Damascus, which had trees not in its courtyard, but certainly very nearby, or possibly the Umayyad Mosque of Aleppo, constructed in gardens that formerly belonged to the Byzantine cathedral. The courtyard of the Mosque of Amr seems to have had trees. At least by the 12th century, the Medina Mosque had trees because the traveler Ibn Jubayr saw 15 palm trees growing there. In the 14th century, the traveler Ibn Battuta saw tall orange trees growing in the courtyard of the Congregational Mosque of Malaga. I'm looking at our Malagan fellow for confirmation. Of course, we don't have the mosque anymore. And in 1586, in post-conquest Seville, Seville had been Christianized by this point, a visitor noticed that the courtyard of the cathedral, formerly the Congregational Mosque, was densely planted with rows of irrigated orange trees and fruit-bearing palms. Those that you see there today that I'm showing you were reinstallations in the 20th century by the building's conservator, but it was done on a very careful reading of the texts, and we know that there were trees growing there. In Damascus, Aleppo, Jerusalem, Medina, Malaga, Seville, the witnesses and documents do date to a period somewhat later than the foundation of the mosques. But with Cordoba, the evidence dates to the early 9th or possibly the late 8th century, because the imam dies in 806. So if we have testimony from him, it could have been testimony given 10 or 20 years earlier. That is the very date of the mosque's construction. Seals of the city of Cordoba from 1262, or this later one from 1446, show the city along the banks of the river And you can see the arched bridge, the walls of the mosque, the minaret, and two palms peeking over the walls of the mosque. By the 14th century, of course, the mosque was being used as a church. But given our 11th century legal testimony, there is no reason to believe that these trees were anything but the later generations of the ones that had been planted there centuries earlier. In 1557, we have documents that state quite specifically that there were sweet and sour orange trees, lemons, and limes planted there. So we have lots and lots of documentary evidence as well as visual evidence to support this idea of a continually planted garden. A 1741 painting in the archive of the Cathedral of Cordoba reveals that the courtyard continued to be densely planted with a regular grid of orange trees interspersed with cypresses and palms. Altogether, this evidence shows that the Mosque of Cordoba's courtyard was planted at least from the early 9th century to the present, which is what I'm going to put in print, but I'm telling you now that it's really the late 8th century. And indeed, there's every reason to believe that the mosque courtyard was planted from the very moment that the mosque was constructed. And I have a very full explanation of this in my book on Islamic gardens that is hopefully being printed as I speak. Now, clearly an orchard measuring 120 by 60 meters with some 95 trees, most of them orange trees, which are thirsty. They require irrigation. They require not only irrigation, but they require a water source. We have to know where that water comes from. The mosque's present fountains, the fountains that you see in the courtyard today, are post-Islamic. But we know from texts that the mosque had fountains both in and outside of the courtyard. Large fountains were typical features in mosques throughout the early Islamic world, serving not only for the required ritual ablution, but also often as sources for the community's water supply. Again, this is that act of beneficence that the ruler brings to his people. In the late 8th century, an ablution fountain was constructed on the east side of the prayer hall. And here, again, you must remember that the original prayer hall was here. And so there was an ablution fountain right here. As the mosque was expanded, that ablution fountain was erased, but another one has in fact been excavated. And so we know the exact footprint, and we know quite a bit about, the archaeologist knows quite a bit about that 10th century ablution fountain that replaced the earlier one. Clearly, water was an important element in the initial planning of this mosque and in all of its stages of growth. It was needed both for ablutions and for irrigating the trees in the courtyard. But what was the source of the water? The mosque was built on the south edge of the walled Medina, the walled city, at the point where the great Roman bridge, which you see in the background here, spanned the Guadalquivir. I say it's a Roman bridge because it was built by the Romans and then rebuilt by the Muslims in the 8th century. At this place, where the river rushed precipitously through the bridge's arched openings, which is the best place to put your water wheel because the water current is faster there. It's been artificially accelerated. At this place, we have seen that there were numerous water wheels that powered mills and lifted water to the gardens of the palace. And the gardens of the palace were right here, actually right next to the mosque itself. However, water wheels, despite their scenic grandeur, are not a very effective way of responding to water shortages. During the summer months, when irrigation is most needed, water wheels, ironically, yield the least water because the river current is sluggish. In fact, the river may dry to a trickle, and it cannot drive the wheel. Moreover, although water wheels provide quick access to water when it's readily available at source, they are useless for storing it. And remember, Cordoba has lots of water in the winter months, but none in the summer months. That's when you need your water, but that's the moment when the river isn't running. For the dry season, you need a reservoir or a cistern where water can be saved. And preferably, this reservoir or cistern will be at as high a level as possible. So now we have to think not only hydraulically, but also topographically. The fundamental rule about hydraulics is that while water flows downward of its own accord, moving it up to a higher level is costly and labor-intensive. Water is one of the hardest things to move because it is formless and it is very heavy. In water catchment, it is always best to trap the water at a high point of origin and use natural gravity to let it flow downward to the point of consumption. The high points in Cordoba are not the river. The high points in Cordoba were the Sierra, these mountains. If this is Cordoba and there's our mosque on the river, very near a water source, but the water source is useless. The high points are the Sierra, these mountains or high hills to the northwest, and the mosque itself. The mosque was the highest building in town. The first source of water was a catchment system on the roof of the prayer hall, and that's where we are right now. I was very lucky. Most people, when they go to the mosque, they want to see the mihrab, but I'm a peculiar human being in that I really wanted just to go up to the rooftop to see where all the guttering was, and they took me up there. I was very lucky. The water that fell on this enormous rooftop was captured through a system of deep sloping runnels, deep enough for a human being to walk inside. These runnels carried the runoff to spouts along the facade of the prayer hall. And there's one of them right there. In the original prayer hall, there were 11 aisles running from the Qibla wall to the facade of the courtyard, which meant that there were 10 water channels. From here, it poured into the courtyard, soaking the soil thoroughly before it was caught in the surface channels that carried it to the tree beds. Today, these are paved, but we know from documents that at the very early stages, this was an earthen floor. So these would have been very simple, hand-excavated mud channels. The mosque was enlarged several times in the next 200 years, and its hydraulic support system was also expanded. In the 9th century, Abdurrahman II pushed the prayer hall south. So this is his addition right here. And he also built an aqueduct to supply Cordoba with drinking water. It's not clear whether this aqueduct reached the mosque or not. By the 10th century, Cordoba had become a wealthy and prestigious cultural center with an expanding Muslim population, and in response to this, Abdurrahman III extended the mosque's courtyard to the north, so this is his extension right here, and as part of the same building campaign, his son, Al-Hakam II, pushed the prayer hall south by 14 bays and embellished that Qibla wall with the very famous mihrab and dome for which the mosque is famous today. So at this point, we have a very large, venerable mosque with a rooftop catchment system that sent water into the courtyard where it was distributed by surface channels and stored for longer periods in small underground cisterns. But apparently this was not sufficient. In 967, a large stone channel with lead piping was built to bring water from the mountains in the northwest of Cordoba. According to one account, it flowed into the mosque's irrigation canals and ablution basins on the east and west sides, which suggests, I think it tells us, that the courtyard had at least 2 fountains to receive the seasonal supply provided from the roof. The mosque was greatly expanded in the 10th century under the vizier regent Al-Mansur, who ruled for 25 years, at least in practice, if not in name. Al-Mansur extended the prayer hall eastward by the addition of 8 aisles, which, in terms of rooftop catchment, meant 8 new runnels. Although Al-Mansur had a firm grasp of power, he was, of course, regent, and his authority was entirely dependent upon his position, his relationship to the young Umayyad prince. And for this reason, his amplification of the prayer hall was very conservative. And proof of that is that this is one of the old Qibla walls that was punched through when the new Qibla wall was built. But when the addition on this side was built, although there was, in fact, no Qibla wall here, this was just flat ground, Al-Mansur replicated it as if to suggest that this mosque was just a this portion of the mosque was just a natural extension of the old prayer hall. politically a very calculated way of making reference to the older building, even as he expanded it. The new fabric matched the old. Likewise, when the courtyard was amplified, because it's not just the prayer hall, but also the courtyard, it too was planted with trees to match the older part of the courtyard. Now, a larger prayer hall and a larger courtyard meant more worshipers and also more trees, both of which needed more water. And so in 991-92, a very large, very deep cistern, not just a small thing, but a really huge, it's the size of a building, was excavated in the courtyard floor. And you're looking at a section of it. This just gives you a sense of the scale. And this is it in section, and this is it in plan. It's something like 12 meters, I think, on each side, which is quite large. The canal that led to this new cistern was but one piece in an extensive hydraulic network of surface canals, tunnels, and raised aqueducts that brought water from the mountains and distributed it to the city of Cordoba. So we've just really jumped in scale from getting most of the water from the rooftop now to getting probably most of the water from a canal that comes from the mountains. And, of course, it's coming from the mountains, and it's not only watering the mosque, but also watering the city, the farms outside of it, including some huge, magnificent royal palaces that were built on that west side of Cordoba. I already mentioned that Abdurrahman II had built an aqueduct in the 9th century to supply Cordoba with water. 100 years later, a second aqueduct was constructed or perhaps restored, this is an interesting point, by Abdurrahman III to provide water for these various palaces that he had built in the countryside surrounding Cordoba. I just have to say I made this image very quickly. There are in fact many more estates here that we could add just to show you that there's a kind of densification happening along the river. This is a very fertile valley right here. Perhaps the most important palace is Medinat Sahra, and Yasser Taba showed you some very lovely slides from there. But Medinat Sahra was not the westernmost expansion. There was another one currently being excavated by a German archaeological team right here that had a huge tank of water. In fact, it had 2 tanks. I have a palace on here that's actually doesn't belong there yet. It's a little early. But my point being that there's starting to be a kind of buildup of palaces that require a lot of water because they have gardens, and gardens always require water. The aqueduct of Valdepuentes in the mountains above the palace city was intended to serve not only the palace of Medinat Sahra, which we saw in the aerial map, but also that community that sprang up around it, a community of kind of manorial estates, of noble estates, as well as royal palaces. The trajectory to which this aqueduct belonged was a mixed system of surface canals, gently graded with tunnels and bridges where it passed over uneven terrain, in its entirety, eventually reaching a length of more than 18 kilometers. So this is just the most famous stretch of it because it has the lovely little horseshoe arches, but it really belongs to a kind of topographic logic of landscape outside of Medinat Sahra and extending all the way to Cordoba. It extended from natural streams in the high mountains to the palace, built on the slope of one such hill, and then ultimately along that alluvial river plain to the city. This aqueduct was clearly Islamic, but for the most part, the longer network to which it belonged, although restored and extended under the direction of the Hispano-Umayyad rulers, belonged to the Roman era. The Romans built numerous villas along the Guadalquivir Valley. There have been 16 rediscovered in the area of Cordoba. There have been almost 200 in the region of Seville, which is just downstream a little ways. So the Guadalquivir Valley was kind of just a huge Roman suburb almost. And of course, the Romans developed a comprehensive hydraulic network to serve these villas. The major branches of the Aqua Augustana, built in Cordoba in the 1st century CE, have been traced by archaeologists. And this just shows you one branch of it. This is the branch that goes through Medinat Sahra. Here's the Val de Puentes bridge that we saw. There's our palace city. There's Cordoba. But there's a whole nother branch of the aqueduct that goes off to the north side. The thing to remember is that for the most part, these Roman waters are coming from the west and from the north. Most of this water system is invisible from ground level. You could walk around Cordoba for days and not realize that there are streams running underground. But the remains of a small Roman surface canal can still be seen on the west side of Cordoba. Easy to miss, right there. There's a little children's playground next to it, which is how I happened to notice it. And then also running along the west side of the walls, here's Cordoba, here's one of the branches of the aqueduct, another branch, and it's on this side of the city right here that we have this canal and this actually active waterbed right here. And a kind of modern reinstallation along the exact same bed of the old Roman watercourse. So in Cordoba, whenever I see water, I'm conscious of the fact that although it might look modern, it's the same water that's been flowing for 2,000 years, and usually along the same logical gravitational bed that it flowed for 2,000 years. Almost 2,000 years ago, this would have been linked to this lively stream that flows along the outside face on the western side of the city. The water network had presumably deteriorated in the late Roman and Visigothic period, perhaps as a direct result of the devastating Vandal attacks in the early 5th century. There is certainly evidence that the agricultural economy as a whole had flagged, and if agriculture flags, probably water also deteriorates. And it flagged for multiple reasons that included repression of the cultivators and merchants and also population decline. When the conquering Muslim armies arrived in Cordoba in 711, the Roman bridge, for example, that spanned the wide Guadalquivir, the bridge is actually right here, was so deteriorated that it was unusable, and they had to ford the river at a point downstream. This is just to give you a sense of just how in such bad shape the city was in. They found the western walls of the city in an equally ruinous state. And the condition of this west wall is significant because, for reasons of natural topography, the Roman aqueducts mostly terminated on the west and also northern side of Cordoba. Therefore, the new Muslim governors set about rebuilding the city walls, the bridge, and restoring the water systems that served the city. Thinking about the rise and fall of water systems brings to mind the great historian Ibn Khaldun, who in the 14th century noted the link between population size and water networks. And he wrote, "Know then that the standard of living and wealth of a society will depend on the number of its members. Do you not see how, in thinly populated districts, even springs and rivers cease to flow? For the overflow of springs is helped by the drawing of water, which is a human act, just as the udders of animals are developed by milking. If then there should be no more drawing out, the spring will slacken and dry up. This can clearly be seen in countries which enjoyed much water in the days when they supported a large population. When, however, destruction overtook them, the springs dried up as though they had never been." Well, Ibn Khaldun was a great historian, but he wasn't great at hydraulics. It didn't extend to the technical knowledge, because here he seems to be suggesting that drawing water encourages its flow. But in fact, it is the maintenance of the water system that ensures an abundant and continuous supply. Small wonder, then, that the chroniclers and geographers of Al-Andalus credited Muslim patrons with not restoration, but the actual building of these water systems that we now know archaeologically to have been, in large part, Roman. To return to the great mosque, just as the prayer hall was superimposed on a church site with older fabric and meaning, the courtyard garden was also connected to an earlier historic period through its use of water. Water is, after all, eternal. The aqueduct that brought water to the city of Cordoba and the congregational mosque was an extension of a Roman aqueduct, repaired in the Umayyad period, and its reuse was simply part of the eclecticism and practicality that characterized the Umayyads of Spain. It's one of the characteristics of the Umayyads of Spain that I love. They just are very open towards their environment and also to the kind of remnants of past civilizations. Roman and Visigothic stone pieces were prominently reused in the Cordoba Mosque. We see two examples here. So perhaps we can consider the recirculation of water and reuse of its channels as a similar phenomenon. Historical discourse has focused almost entirely on the specific cultural significance of the mosque, and it is indeed a compelling and historically important monument. But just as it has an artistic and cultural context, it also belongs to an environmental context. In time, the Great Mosque of Cordoba became connected to a much larger environmental system of water management that included not only the mosque, but also the city of Cordoba, its river plain, and hills. The specific methods for water management employed in Cordoba were technically no different from those used elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The challenge was not the lack of water, but the uneven precipitation through the seasons, necessitating a system of collection, storage, and delivery. The specific Islamic genius was not in inventing new ways to collect and deliver the water. Water wheels, aqueducts, cisterns, and rooftop catchment had all been employed by the Romans, and even the Romans didn't invent it. Rather, in Al-Andalus, we can observe the gradual expansion of the hydraulic system from one that is highly local to one that spread across the city and surrounding landscape. The expanding water system is, of course, a sign of expanding population. Either the availability of more water allowed the community to grow, or population growth put pressure on Cordoba's leaders to find new resources. In any case, one observer noted that in its heyday, the area between Cordoba and Medina Sahra was so densely settled that the road between them was brightly illuminated by the light of lamps placed close to one another. And a modern archaeological survey confirmed that household wells were sometimes sunk as close as 3 to 4 meters apart on that side of the city. So this is a sign of a very dense population. Such intensification of residential development must have required complex and extensive hydraulics. So to summarize and conclude, the story of water in Islamic Cordoba begins with individual buildings supplied by small water systems, rooftop catchment supplying a cistern on site. I have focused specifically on the monumental mosque, but the same individualized water capturing techniques would have been employed at any fairly large self-sufficient house or farm. The scale then gradually shifted to a system with a broad environmental compass, in which the patronage of the ruler was everywhere evident. The shift was not caused by changes in technology. As I said, water wheels and aqueducts were very old techniques that were simply revived. Rather, what changed between the early 8th and late 10th century was the complexity of Umayyad society and the size of its population. Cordoba, the Umayyad capital, had become fantastically wealthy, so much so that 1/3 of its annual tax revenues could be lavished on the construction of a single palace, and that was Medina Sahra. As Cordoba increasingly prospered, the city expanded and more farms and palaces were built out in the countryside, as we have seen. At the same time, a hydraulic system was built that relied on diverse forms of water supply, and thus had greater elasticity to withstand periods of drought. Shifting from a site-based model to a system of connected nodes, in which the Great Mosque was linked to Medina Sahra, the city to the countryside, and the mountains to the river. Much the same phenomenon exists in today's world, except the emphasis has shifted from one of plenitude and the expanding availability of clean, fresh water to its increasing scarcity. And Mohammed Al-Assad gave us a paper on this very topic yesterday. As in the past, places today are all interconnected. Drawing water from the ground in one area affects the availability of groundwater in other areas. Taking water from the river upstream deeply affects the amount of water available to communities living downstream. The theme of this conference is water, which has deep political resonance and importance. Although as a citizen of today's world, I am concerned for the present and future, as a historian, I look to the past and admire the visionary and beneficent planning that made water more and more available to the people of Córdoba. Thank you.